Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Hey, good afternoon. The Association of American Medical Colleges is pleased to welcome you to today's session of how to hijack anxiety for the med school application process at the virtual fair. As a reminder, the session recording will be available approximately 24 hours after the live presentation, and the link will be posted in the auditorium of the virtual fair platform. Also, we'll be taking questions from the audience at the end of the presentation. However, please feel free to enter your question at any time within the Q&A box, and we've muted all participant audio. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rosie Hunter. Dr. Hunter is the founder and CEO of TestWolf, an organization that uses cognitive behavioral strategies to help students overcome test anxiety. In addition to her formal education, Dr. Hunter trained as an active duty Army psychologist at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center and was deployed to Afghanistan with the 101st Airborne Division. The Army was the foundation for her understanding of trauma, courage, and leadership, guiding how she practices today. Please welcome Dr. Rosie Hunter.
Hi, all. It is wonderful to be with you today. I am so appreciative of the AAMC and Laura and Don and everybody who has helped set up this session. It is truly going to be jam-packed. There's so many of you eager to live your dreams as a practicing physician. And as someone who went through some rigorous training in my PhD program and my licensure process, I know that being on the cusp of those dreams and having anxiety in the way can be terrifying, and you're sort of thinking, how do I get through this? And so my goal is to give you as much as possible as I can from the evidence-based strategies that there are to help you manage anxiety so that you can get a head start, you can get an advantage in the process, and just do your very best. So please populate the Q&A as much as you can. I am not a motivational speaker and I am not a Zoom expert or tech expert. So you might see me popping up and back like this. And that is so that you can see all of the good tips, all the good strategies that are packed into the presentation. I've also added this little icon to certain slides so that will trigger you to take a screenshot or to take a picture of it on your phone. That's going to be the slides that have the most information. And like I said, I'm going to try to give you all that I have to give you good tips. So it'll go fast. So make sure you're taking pictures that you can look back on later and use in your application process. Okay, so how can you feel empowered and confident in this process? You can become an expert in anxiety. Right? That's why I'm going to share so much about the foundations of anxiety and wrapping your brain around this thing. You know, it's a big deal to process, but why is anxiety on board? How is it on board? How does it become unhelpful? Becoming an expert in that will allow you to work against it. And so we'll talk about how to practice being an expert, how to exercise that expertise, and then especially how to apply that expertise for your MCAT, for those situational judgment tasks, for some of those new fancy interviews they do with the videos, right, and the screenings. What can you do to apply what you know about anxiety to these situations, and honestly, to med school and beyond? I work with a lot of folks facing step 1 and step 2 and board exams and shelf exams, and all of this is relevant for all of that too, because you've got a hardiness that you need for this career ahead of you, and we want to set you up for success. So questions in the Q&A, comments in the chat, everything's welcome. But first, and I know a lot of you are thinking about standardized tests, so let's do like a standardized test question, shall we? What would you do for this student who's preparing for the MCAT if you were an expert in anxiety and someone needed your help? And now I think you can put your responses in the chat, but other people can't see it other than the host, me and Don, and our colleagues from AAMC can see it. But just think about what would you do when I describe this scenario, and then I'm going to give you a multiple choice set of answers, right? Don't want to trigger anybody studying for that MCAT already, but let's get ready for it. This is Ellen. This is a stock image, but Ellen is my sister's name. So Ellen has been preparing for the MCAT, imagine this, for 300 hours. She's done all the things that they say that you should do. And she completed one of those marquee, well-developed test prep programs that guarantees that 515 plus. She performed within the range of her goals on a recent full-length practice test. However, 3 weeks ago, her heart started racing and she started sweating while she was practicing some of the critical analysis and reasoning skills. She 2 weeks ago had a full-blown panic attack during her last planned full-length practice test, so bad that she thought something was going on cardiovascularly. She went to urgent care, and she's scheduled to take an official MCAT in 2 weeks. So now you're the expert in anxiety. You can only choose one thing to do for this student. And this is great, right? Because you're already kind of imagining being a provider. So put your provider hat on. What would you choose? Here are your choices. And after I get through, there's going to be 5 choices. Go ahead and commit to one of them. And we'll see how you do. A is prescribe a mild medication to relieve anxiety. When you get to med school, you'll learn the difference between all these different categories of anxiolytic medications. But you could prescribe a mild one, tell her to take it before her next practice test, and take it on the way to take her MCAT 10 minutes before on test day. You can tell her, keep studying, and let's use some grounding techniques. Teach her some grounding techniques. If you feel anxious, you can go to the bathroom, you can splash water on your face, you can practice deep breathing, you can do whatever you need to do in the moment and practice those things now. You can help her understand the autonomic nervous system, what triggers that physiological anxiety, and then help her discern the difference. For example, if you can get up and walk around, your heart is still pumping blood, it's not a heart attack. Teach her about catastrophizing, and just educate her about the cognitive behavioral strategies. You can teach her to intentionally overbreathe or hyperventilate to elicit the discomfort that comes from panic intentionally, and have her do that for 10 minutes every day for the next 2 weeks, daily. And then, of course, prior to her final practice test. And then the last one, you can say, okay, look, you've got a little bit of a buffer. You went to the AAMC virtual fair. You're a student who's on top of things. You've got a little more time. Why don't you keep studying, postpone the test, and let's get to the root of this. Let's spend a month exploring the test symbolizes the origins of perfectionism, fears of failure, and other root causes. What would you have this person do if you were the expert in anxiety and they presented in your office? Just go for it. You know, there's nobody grading this test. Like everybody, okay, I have seen all kinds of things. Somebody just flew by, said a combination. We've got E's, we've got C's, we've got B or E's, we've got Constance says something, Toby, Jackie, Jaron, Jacob, Miranda, all kinds of folks. Mariah, Andrea, A, Tiffany, I think said A, Anna Grace said probably B. Yes, lots and lots and lots and lots of thoughts about what to do here. And I love a flair for some drama. So this is to be continued. We're going to come back to this after we get through some material, and it's going to congeal in your head, I promise. Look at the faces. Okay, so anxiety 101. Remember, you're going to be an expert in anxiety. And these are a lot of things that you've heard about anxiety before. We're going to try to pull it together in a way that you can be your own coach through this test taking process. Okay, so anxiety 101, here we go. Why does anybody experience anxiety? I bring you back to the primordial forest of old, where our ancestors had to survive. Here they are, trying to make it in the old place where there's lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. If you did not run from the lions, tigers, and bears, and you've heard this evolutionary theories of anxiety before, if you didn't run from the lions, tigers, and bears, you are not our ancestors. We inherited the brains of skittish people, the most skittish people. And when you get to med school and you get through A semester, you'll be able to describe this way better than I can. But our old parts of our brains starts way down here, right? The oldest parts of our brains are down here. Where are my neuroscience people at? That old part of our brain does some automatic stuff. And one of the automatic things it does for us is prepare us to fight off a saber-toothed tiger if a saber-toothed tiger is around, right? That brainstem, yes, thank you. That brainstem in the very base does this automatic thing where it rushes chemicals, it rushes blood, and it allows us to have that fight, flight, or even that freeze response. That's a gift of fear that we're all hardwired with, and that the human species is here because of it. So when we get to test anxiety, you have to know that the goal for the absence of physiological symptoms is not a goal that you ever want to strive for. If you're walking down a dark alley and somebody jumps out, you don't want that part of your brain to not be connected because you passed the MCAT or you got their score on the MCAT that you wanted. You still want that part of your brain connected. So that's anxiety gift number one, that fight, flight, or freeze response, directly related to performance under pressure. Old brain stuff. So this stuff creates all of these sensations that we now associate with panic, that we associate with performance under pressure, that we associate with time running out in a section that we need to do well on. And everybody has their own brand. If you ever see me giving a talk anywhere, you'll never see me in gray because my fight, flight, or freeze response involves armpit sweat, right? Everybody has their own. Maybe it's fidgeting. Maybe it's difficulty concentrating. Maybe it's sweat, head sweat, foot sweat, hand sweat, whatever it is. We all have our own version of this fight or flight response that comes up when we're in a high pressure situation, even if it doesn't involve a saber-toothed tiger, right? It's still a remnant of that thing that was designed for the saber-toothed tiger. Okay. But our brains didn't stop there. I have a cat. He's got that ability too. He's hardwired with that fight, flight, or freeze response. If we were walking through my neighborhood in Texas and we saw a saber-toothed tiger, he would have the same fight or flight response. But he wouldn't remember that, oh my gosh, my grandkitties could get eaten by the same saber-toothed tiger. One of the things that makes us human is our huge frontal lobes. And our huge frontal lobes said, oh my gosh, we can worry about and anticipate things before they happen. We can anticipate the implications of things that are nonviolent attacks on our species, things like standardized tests. And so we have this new brain ability to anticipate and manage threat. That is why we can farm, which is why we can have an existence that is strategic. Important stuff. So remember that these two gifts of test anxiety or of anxiety that the whole species experiences is not specific to your experience. So your specific experience of anxiety may include these four components. And let's look at these in the context of test anxiety specifically. But if we're talking about social anxiety, if we're talking about PTSD, whatever we're talking about, it manifests in these ways. Our body only has certain tricks. The first, and we all have a sort of variety of things that we experience, but the first is going to be our thoughts. And I'm going to hide myself a little bit so you can see this. Our thoughts are the ideas in our head. I can't do this. Everyone else is done. My heart is racing out of control. And we come by these things honestly, right? We come by these things when it comes to test taking, by our early experiences, however that teacher acted when it was the state test in fourth grade, the things that you learned, and the storytelling about your own abilities, the accommodations that you need, any kind of diagnoses, all of that stuff is on board when we talk about what our thoughts become. And then we have our physical sensations. And so we can have thoughts about our physical sensations. My heart is racing out of control is different from your heart actually racing. Sweating, like I mentioned, friendly neighborhood armpit sweater over here. Difficulty concentrating. Why is difficulty concentrating a part of the fight, flight, or freeze response? Because if you're staring in just one place when the saber-toothed tiger is circling your camp, you're not going to be likely to see where it pops out everywhere, right? So if you get on a question on the MCAT or any other standardized test and you are zeroing in, your brain will say, but what about the saber-toothed tiger? Don't you need to pay attention to every little noise in the room? Don't you need to start reading all the different answer choices? Don't you need to sort of not read it in order? It'll start to sort of have you skitter around. And that is a part of that fight, flight, or freeze response. Behaviors rushing, skipping questions. Now, why would we do that when our goal is to perform well? It's because we're hardwired to try to get out of situations that are aversive. If something is making us feel uncomfortable, our brain says that could be because there's a saber-toothed tiger involved. And so we want to get through the discomfort itself. Are hardwired with the fear of fear itself. So we rush, we skip, um, we avoid the bad outcomes, maybe by canceling our scores, thinking, oh gosh, I think that went really bad. I think I'm going to cancel my score. Or postponing the test, avoiding the distress, postponing the practice test. Lots of different ways that we can engage in behavioral avoidance. And so I just want to come up and emphasize that behavioral avoidance is the reason why anxiety becomes impairing, right? Your heart racing isn't naturally going to kill you, and it doesn't naturally mean that you forget everything that you know. It's the skipping the strategy that you learned in your Kaplan and your Princeton review and whatever kind of from your local tutor, from whatever kind of test prep you took from the AMC sessions today. Whatever test prep you went to, if you have strategies and you abandon those strategies, it's the abandonment that causes the impairment. It's not the fear that you can't do it. Nuanced, but important to remember. Okay. Feelings. What are feelings? Feelings are overarching terms we assign to the complex combination of things that we're experiencing. And as you go through this process, your mom, sisters, neighbors, cousins, dogs are going to ask you, hey, how's it going? Aren't you applying to med school? We're so proud of you. Hey, how's it going? And you're going to say, I'm overwhelmed, back off. Or you're going to say, oh, it's just a lot of pressure. It's a lot of stress. You're much more likely to describe the feelings than you are the other components of anxiety. And so one key takeaway from our conversation today that you can do, this small thing that you can do to help yourself, is to describe the other components of anxiety. I'm having the thought that I can't do this, right? Instead of saying I am overwhelmed, or I am exhausted, say I am staying up very late worrying about letting my family down, right? Say the more precise component of the anxiety instead of the catch-all term, but always validate the catch-all term. Your feelings aren't up for negotiation. If you feel overwhelmed and stressed, I know you're going to be frustrated when people say, don't feel that way. Try to describe the thoughts, the physical sensations, the behaviors for yourself, because I'm about to tell you what to do about those things, but you have to describe them precisely in order to know what to do about them. Okay. When is test anxiety a problem? First of all, I applaud you for being on this call at all, right? It means that you've said, okay, it's going to be hard to get in med school. It's going to be hard to succeed at med school. It's in med school. It's going to be hard to get the rotations and to get, the positions that I want, to get the specialty that I want. All of that's going to be hard. So you're already setting yourself up to do a courageous thing. So test anxiety is problematic when it stops your courage from choosing and your interest from choosing what you do. Test anxiety is also a problem when even if you have the courage and you have the motivation and you take the steps, it comes along for the ride and kind of docks your score, right? In golf, people have a handicap. If this comes along and says, hey, yeah, whatever your score is minus this, that's whatever your knowledge, effort, and approach would naturally give you as a score, minus anxiety, that's what we're going to say your score is, right? Because then you're not representing yourself and your ability effectively. And so we want to make sure that you can represent yourself and your ability effectively so that you can have a good, honest admissions process. I'll tell you a secret about me. I love standardized tests. I am fascinated by the scoring. I love a good, well-made test, and the MCAT actually is very well-made test. We'll talk about a little bit about that. USMLE test that you take in med school, well-made test. Those people write those tests real well. But I don't want you to be miserable through the process. Testing aside, it doesn't help me when I go out in the world and I have a provider who has just been white knuckling it for a decade of their life and is not able to enjoy and be satisfied with the amazing support and treatment that they're giving to me. That makes me sad inside. So test anxiety is a problem. Performance anxiety is a problem just because it makes you miserable. Even if you're getting the best scores ever, it's not okay to just let fear come along for the ride for your whole career. Okay, 3 steps to crushing anxiety related to the application process, related to the MCAT, frankly, related to your success in med school. The first is to challenge and choose your thoughts. And this is like, 199, like at 1% of the citations for cognitive behavioral therapy as a treatment for anxiety. So we're talking about challenging and choosing your thoughts. We're talking about understanding the assignment of standardized tests, right? It's not a referendum on how smart you are. It is a referendum on your ability to not just study, but to execute, to roll out what you've learned. And so we're going to talk about understanding the assignment. And then this is a little phrase, and Dawn mentioned at the start of this that I was in the military. So I use a lot of phrases that seem a little strange for, a suburban work from home mom, but like get after it and train how you fight. And that's because I want you to take an aggressive stance towards your anxiety. And so, yeah, I'll be in my little house here yelling, get after it, because you can go after the anxiety and manage it and tone it down. Okay, so let's talk about challenging and choosing your thoughts. I'm going to do a little bit of CBT 101, and then I'm going to real fast show you an example of my favorite sort of structured approach to cognitive restructuring, which is to say, one day you're just, oh my gosh, it is 2 in the morning. Your MCAT's not coming up for 3 months, but you're just worried, right? You're just obsessed with this idea of, am I doing the right class? Are my practice test scores going up fast enough? What can you do about that in that moment that takes 15 minutes? So I'm going to describe that real quick. But first, I'm going to talk about CBT 101. Just a show of hands, just somebody wave if you've ever heard of cognitive behavioral therapy or gone to it or tried it or read about it. I want to see all the thumbs up. Yes, some clapping. Great. This is a very logistical thing. Look at this celebration of hands. I love it. CBT 101. So this is going to be familiar. CBT 101 says it is not just the case that things happen to us and that's what leads to our feelings and behaviors. Oh my gosh, not a party hat for the CBT. That's how I feel all the time in my head. We are trained to think like this. Events happen, things happen, and that's what leads to our feelings and behaviors. And it's everywhere. And I love a little trash, a little rag, a little gossip. Remember this? This feels like years ago now. But once upon a time, Will Smith went on stage and he hit Chris Rock, much smaller person, and he said, this happened because you said something about my partner and I didn't appreciate it. Right? And we all say, oh, yeah, he was triggered by something. We love triggered by something that this person said about his partner. And so that's a way of explaining the world that says events lead to feelings and behaviors. And we do this a lot with road rage. That person cut me off, and that's why I was mad, and staring at them and pointing at them and doing worse here in Texas, much worse. And so we talk about that all the time. We reinforce that. When you want to manage anxiety, depression, any kind of behavioral condition, you want to stop telling yourself that story in subtle ways. CBT, the foundation of CBT, the cognitive model is that things don't lead directly to our feelings and behaviors. Things happen and they lead to thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations that we hold dear. And that's what leads to our feelings and behaviors. And we know this is especially true when we're talking about things other than the saber-toothed tiger, right? There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. That's an extreme way of understanding this, right? There are some things that we experience that are going to be natural triggers. But when we get into that area of when you're up a little too late worrying about this, it's gone past the point of productive worry. Then we're in this territory of I'm sprinkling something on top of this external event that is leading to the feelings and behaviors I don't want. So we combat that by challenging those thoughts and by approaching anxiety instead of avoiding anxiety. More on that later. But just here's a little bit of what I'll say about that before we get even more into it. Let me actually go back to visiting with Ellen. We need to teach our brains and our bodies that these are not the same. This person is sitting in a chair. Now, nobody takes tests on paper anymore. I understand that. This is anachronistic at best. But still, taking your MCAT on the computer, wherever you take it, it is not the same as fighting off the saber-toothed tiger. But your brain doesn't have a logical connection. That old part of your brain back there, it doesn't have a logical connection to reality in that way. It reasons backwards from your avoidance behavior. So if you constantly put off that extra set of practice questions, if you constantly put off watching this YouTube video or that YouTube video, that old part of your brain says, oh my goodness, we must be avoiding this because it is an apex predator. And it learns to really fear the situation. So it's super, super important that you teach it another way by approaching the saber-toothed tiger that isn't really a saber-toothed tiger and saying, see, this is safe. I'm not going to die. I'm not going to be torn from limb to limb if I do an extra practice test before I know my score has gone up, for example. Okay, here's an example strategy. We'll come back to some of the avoidance stuff. Here's an example of strategy for how to challenge and choose your thoughts. And we're going to go through this quick. And that's partly because this is open domain. You can find a whole bunch of good examples for how to do this. I recommend the Association for Behavioral Cognitive Therapies website is great. There's a fantastic book called Feeling Good and a new edition called Feeling Great that helps you learn how to do this stuff. So challenging and choosing your thoughts, step one is to identify those unhelpful thoughts. Our thoughts go racing by at warp speed, but the truth is that we can slow them down and actually see what they're saying. We can identify those thoughts and confront them head on. So if you have that outcome, the feelings and behaviors you don't want, you can reasonably assume that some of those thoughts are unhelpful and you need to look straight at it. And you're the expert on your brain, so you'll be able to look straight at it. Number two is to identify the emotions and the feelings associated with it. If you are somebody who says happy, sad, mad, and that's about it, I encourage you to take a look at a feelings wheel, and it'll have all kinds of different descriptions of those feelings because we want to reinforce to our brain the impact of that thought and how it's leading to the feeling. So we have to stutter step on that and make that clear. The next step is to identify the cognitive distortion. And we'll go through these pretty quickly, but the big idea, and this is Simone Biles, doing a Simone Biles, the big idea is that our thoughts can't just simply cause us distress because they're just simply true. Our thoughts have to do some funky, elaborate gymnastics to really terrorize us in a way that has us up and 2 in the morning, has us skipping questions, has us postponing practice tests, doing all the things that aren't in our best interest. So we want to sit there, look at our thoughts, realize the feelings that they are associated with, and then identify the cognitive distortion so we can start to chip away at the logic of them. So what are some of these cognitive distortions that we might see? These kinds of worry-related things. Things like fortune telling and catastrophizing. I'm going to fail my exam, and so I will never be a doctor. Right? We can't literally do that. So it is a cognitive distortion. It's something that our brain has to take on in order to make us afraid. Mind reading. Somehow we don't ever think that we can look at somebody and tell if they love us, but we tend to look at people and think, oh, I know they don't like me. They don't like my outfit. They don't think I'm smart. We believe that suddenly we can see into their heads when they think something negative, right? My parents are going to be, one example I've heard from a lot of students is that if your parents are chipping in on some kind of test prep program, and these things can be very expensive, sometimes you might think, and I see the thumbs up and people sort of saying, yeah, I've had this experience. Thank you for acknowledging that. This is a waste of money for me. I'm not going to ever get any better. What if I don't take advantage of it? And the unfortunate thing about anxiety is it can make it hard to focus in those programs. So I'm a bad test taker. Now, just a show of fake hands, of little Simpsons hands. Who's ever had the thought, I'm a bad test taker? Look at all those thumbs up. I'm a bad test taker. I'm a bad test taker is not something I can Google. I can't Google, hey, did all those people with those thumbs up, did all those people scrolling by right now, are they bad test takers? Where's the list? I can't compare that list to the registrants for the virtual fair, to anybody in attendance. I can't do that. It is a category, a label that we made up. It is not real. And it is 9 times out of 10 related to anxiety affecting your performance. There is no part of your brain for test taking. It's the ability to use your brain when the pressure is on and working against your natural instincts when it seems like a saber-toothed tiger is lurking. So categorical thinking says there are good test takers who just show up and get really high scores, and there's bad test takers like me who will work really hard and always unperform. That's a scary thought. The reason it leads to all kinds of unhelpful feelings is because it's related to not just categorical thinking, but this other thinking error or cognitive distortion that we would call labeling. So once you're a bad test taker, that's all there is. Now, hopefully you'll walk away from this talk in the next 15, 14 minutes and have some tips that improve your test taking. That's what we're going to get to in just a minute. Does that mean you were always a bad test taker, or does that just mean you needed different tips, different strategies? Okay, and then another category, and there's tons of categories of these things, are things like unhelpful thoughts. I didn't get enough sleep. Unhelpful thought. In the moment, in the test, you're trying to answer some questions and you're having this idea, oh gosh, the Surgeon General says I need this, and last night I only got that. It is true that you need to do well. You need to pay attention to your sleep, that your brain prefers sleep overall. But if you lose a little sleep the night before, but you have a strategy that you're able to execute, you'll have that adrenaline from that old part of your brain. Thanks, girl. She'll be fueling you with a little extra adrenaline. And that'll help you get through a lot of the exam. More importantly, this is an unhelpful thought. Okay. So what's next step? Disputing those questions. Now I'm dating myself now, but behind this thing that I tried to put up to hide it is a picture of OJ and his defense team. And that's because we don't let anxiety just run amok in our brain, right? We don't, it's not that we want to consider, well, maybe I am a bad test taker, or let me look for the evidence for that. No, we want to say, what evidence do I have that I can't improve my scores? We want to ask gangster questions that chip away at the logic of the anxiety. You are not responsible for exploring all of the scary, unhelpful thoughts and considering whether they're true. It is not useful, a good way to hijack anxiety, to spend all day looking for evidence that you, quote, don't deserve to be a doctor. That's not your job. Somebody else can do that. That's not your job. Your job is try to figure out how to get the thoughts that help you interview well and help you maximize your score on the MCAT. It is not your job to entertain your anxiety and dance with her. So we want to dispute unhelpful thoughts. Don't run from her. Challenge her directly like she's on the stand. I don't know why I say anxiety she, but just bear with me. Choose helpful thoughts, right? We want to choose helpful thoughts. An example of this, a celebrity example of this, everybody probably knows, this is Naomi Osaka. Naomi Osaka took a break from tennis, came back recently, didn't go great. She took a break from tennis because she experiences social anxiety, especially when she has to go to these horrible like precedents after, right? And of course, when she said, hey, she started crying. She said, hey, this really stresses me out. They went and they asked all the other tennis players, hey, how come you don't get stressed out when we're asking you a million questions? And I was delighted to hear this response from Venus Williams before she retired. And she said, oh, I just remind myself before I come out here that none of you can play tennis as well as I can. That is an example of what we call a rational response in CBT. It is something that can fit on a Post-it. It's concise. It's based on exploring the anxiety. And it's something that she tells herself in the moment. So you can develop helpful thoughts by going through this process, step 1 through 5, and use those helpful thoughts even on your practice test. And you want to hold the helpful thoughts to the same standard. Is it working? And Venus Williams says, yeah, I say this thing to myself. I come out, I have a great press conference. I know this thought works. Next question. Here are some examples of things that I've heard from medical school students used as rational responses. Now, don't just jack somebody else's rational response. Go through the steps of the process and try to come up with your own. I love I have a plan based on the item type. It's okay if I don't immediately know the answer to an MCAT question. One of the things that people say for multiple choice test, and I work with people on a variety of different multiple choice tests, working on the LSAT right now, working on lots of USMLE step 1. And when you go through this process and you have the thought, the correct answer is here somewhere, that's a great rational response that challenges, this is a trick question, or this is my weak area. I haven't studied this enough, all those kinds of thoughts. So quick and dirty example of how you challenge and choose your thoughts. You challenge and choose your thoughts in a structure, and you challenge and choose your thoughts on paper. Anxiety lives in your head at 3 in the morning. So if you learn these steps, pull it onto some paper and do it there. Don't fight your enemy on their territory. Okay, what can you expect when you do this kind of thing? And this is an example of a question that doesn't appear on any kind of standardized test because there's no random geography question. But suppose you start with this prompt. I saw all those hands. All those hands flew by when I said, hey, who thinks they're a bad test taker? Suppose you go into a test and you have a question like, what is the capital of Mauritius? Is anybody from Mauritius? I would love that. I actually have a good friend from Mauritius that just left. What is the capital of Mauritius? You have all these answers. If you start with I'm a bad test taker, you'll think I have no idea. This is what this leads to in the test. If I don't know immediately, because that's something we're taught in 4th grade, you need to know immediately. The smart kids know quick. If I don't know immediately, there's nothing I can do. I agree, Neosha. It's very beautiful and Mauritius. If I don't know immediately, there's nothing I can do. I'm failing. C is the most common answer, which, by the way, is a myth. That's not true on well-developed standardized tests. And so starting from the frame of I'm a bad test taker makes you feel helpless and frustrated. It can lead to physiological symptoms if that's your brand of anxiety. But it can lead to reading and rereading the question over and over and then guessing, just bad test behavior, unhelpful test behavior. And honestly, all of those tricks that come from the subreddits that like C is the most common. The likelihood of getting a correct answer doesn't ever go up when you do things like this. If you have the idea, instead, I'm a bad test taker, the idea that I've practiced specific strategies for each section, because that's what the game is on the MCAT and a lot of standardized tests, is to really understand what the question is, the sections are asking of you, and learning that strategy. Then you have that strategy to execute. You're giving your brain something to do instead of something not to do. The correct answer is here. I'll use process of elimination. That leads to you feeling more engaged, more motivated, maybe narrowing it down to 2, marking an answer, keeping and continuing to go. I forgot that sound effect was there, without flagging. So the game for standardized tests is not knowing the right answer and getting every question right. The game is to constantly narrow it down and have a higher than normal chance of getting it right because you constantly narrowed down the answer choices. So that's what quote unquote good test takers are doing. They're not getting everything right all the time. They're tolerating the uncertainty that is required to narrow things down and choose from the things that you've got left. Okay, a few more comments about about understanding the assignment and getting after it. So knowing your stuff is a part of it, but executing and having a strategic approach just as important, right? Understanding how you need to get after every section and building the skill to do that in addition to the knowledge is what's critical to executing on a test. And so here are just a couple of things about the MCAT and then about interviews that I would say to appreciate about the challenge, about the assignment. And this is important in the context of anxiety, and then what the strategy would be. So if you experience a lot of test anxiety, you have to know that well-developed standardized test will make you feel unfamiliar. Every question can make you feel unfamiliar. I appreciate the situational judgment task. There's some med schools, Neosha asked a question about SJTs, situational judgment tasks. So some med schools will give you a prompt and you will respond to it on video as a part of your application process, as a part of the interview process. And so those personality kinds of assessments will also be in this category of SJTs. And some people get more nervous about those things than standardized tests, or more nervous about these behavioral interviews than standardized tests. So they both require different kinds of strategies and approaches based on your understanding of test anxiety. So for the MCAT, the challenge is recognizing that standardized tests at their core are the same, right? They're not trying to trick you. They have to be the same because they have to argue that somebody who took a different version 8 months ago in a different city, their score is comparable to yours. So your advantage is you can know the underlying structure. But in order to be sophisticated, these tests seem unfamiliar on the different questions when you get to the different questions. So your strategy for your anxiety can't be to never see anything unfamiliar because you're setting yourself up for non-success by definition. So having a plan for what to do for each section, no matter what, instead of judging, oh, do I know this? Do I not know this? And living on that roller coaster, having a plan for what to do as you approach different item types is really important for that experience of uncertainty that will come along so that anxiety doesn't waste your time. Anxiety doesn't steal points by saying, oh, we can't know this one. You know exactly what you're supposed to do when you get to that question type. So if you're doing some test prep, and these things can be very expensive, pay attention to the strategy for the question type just as much, if not more, to the actual content that you're memorizing, that you're learning. Okay, these interviews and these sort of video tasks, right, where you're answering a question on video, they require you to accept yourself, right? They require you to accept how you decide to perform without reassurance in the moment. So you want to create opportunities to tolerate yourself and your own judgment. And what I mean by that is videotape yourself speaking on a subject that your friends are prompting, right? For example, if you can, if you are uncomfortable with that. So depending on what you know about anxiety, you'll approach these things a little bit differently. Just a couple of thoughts about how to get after it too. Train how you fight means to take practice tests in the conditions, full length practice tests in the same conditions as you would on test day. And start doing that from as soon as you start studying. Because you don't want to wait until you feel like you're going to get a good score on the practice test. That's not just the point of a practice test. If you have access, especially to free practice tests, and you can take them to understand how anxiety is going to act when you don't have your phone, right? Or when you are limited in terms of your time. When you're sitting in a certain room, how is anxiety going to act then? You want to expose yourself to that. So make a plan and work your plan means to have a schedule and adhere to that schedule as you're preparing. And I prefer things like time blocking over deadlines, right? Instead of saying by this day, I want to have a practice test, say Saturday, the 13th from 10 to 7, I'm going to be taking practice test, whatever it is. Make sure you have commitments instead of kind of deadlines and vague goals. So when you make an anxiety resistant plan for the MCAT, focus on endurance, make and practice any kind of decision you can get out of the way ahead of time. When am I going to flag? When am I going to take my breaks? When am I going to skip an item? Make all those decisions ahead of time so your anxiety is not involved in it on test day. And then for the other elements of the application process, start preparing from the start. Right? Don't just see the MCAT as the albatross that you have to get out of the way. If you know that you're a little bit introverted, you haven't done a lot of interviewing, start preparing for the interviews as well from the start. And you can do that by making small changes. Today, you weren't able to be on video, but if you could have been, go ahead and get on video. Make those small changes in a way that allows you to get comfortable with yourself. So find the camera if you're on a Zoom call and you're on video. Make sure you're trying to look into the camera in the way that you would want your interviewers to see you doing that and not just at your notes. And those are little subtle things you can start doing now. When your friends' parents say, oh, when are you taking your MCAT? Hijack that. Just take back that question as if they asked an interview question that like, why do you want to be a doctor? What specialty would you want? And start answering it like they're the interviewer. Just use their time. That's perfectly fine. And practice all of these things until the anxiety goes down, not until you feel like you have the perfect right answer. It's until you're used to looking yourself in the face, if you're going to have virtual interviews, until you're used to telling people why you want to be a provider and what kind of provider and what school you want to go to. Okay. All right, let's see. Oh, I almost forgot. What about Ellen? She still needs your help. We said prescribe her mild medication, tell her to keep studying, help her understand the autonomic nervous system. Remember, she has these panic sensations. Teach her to intentionally overbreathe, or recommend she keep studying and postpone the exam. As we wrap up, I'm going to give you a quick, who doesn't love a graph? I'm going to give you a quick slide for each of these. And then we'll go to some Q&A. Does that sound good? Okay, let's look at item A. I'm clicking on the wrong screen. Anxiety reducing medication. Anxiety in the moment, these things work, right? These things work in the moment. They will help you sort of reduce a little bit of anxiety. But what are you going to learn about the MCAT? The MCAT means panic. You're going to learn that panic is dangerous. What is your old brain going to learn? The old brain is going to learn that they survived due to the medication. Now, when you get on to med school, there's going to be a lot of different exams of different lengths, and it's going to get a little more complicated, the dosing. And the exams are so frequent and so furious that it can be challenging to start to manage this medication routine. So in a way, this is something that teaches your brain a little bit more avoidance than we'd like. What about B? Bathroom water splashing. If you get up and leave the test and you go in the bathroom and you splash a little water on your face, it will temporarily decrease the anxiety, probably because you've moved away from the threat. It's like, if I briefly hop in my cave and the saber-tooth tiger can't get in there, I'm going to feel a little bit better. The problem with this is you have to go back out in the field to see the saber-tooth tiger. So your anxiety will then start to go up again. So this is a short-term solution. If you recommend it, it can be really helpful. Yes, Samora says, we don't have time to go to the bathroom all day. That's right. There can be a temporary decrease, but it might not be feasible for standardized testing. So your brain learns you've got to step away, otherwise the panic sensations can kill you. And remember, panic sensations, the fight or flight response, is designed to keep you safe. It is not designed to hurt you. It's also designed to be temporary. So if you don't engage in avoidance strategies, it will go down. If you get to the MCAT and you freak out for the first 20 minutes and you stay in it and then apply your strategies, your anxiety will go down. It will not sustain itself for the duration of the test without some kind of a little bit of a ride to be on. So this strategy is hard to manage from a time management perspective. What about explaining the nervous system, panic, and heart attacks? Now, I just did that. And every good psychiatrist you go to, many psychologists that you go to will have a brain on their desk somewhere. I have some kind of brain coin from my Army days. And we love to talk about the brain areas and what this does and what this does. And we love to explain that to you. Now, your anxiety didn't wake up today and say, oh, well, why didn't you just say that? It's much more sophisticated than that. And if in the moment your anxiety says, cute story, I'm going to override this and I am going to hightail it out of this test, then you have set this person up for not success. You have set this person up to escape at that highest peak of their anxiety. So not a great strategy. A lot of you said these combination solutions are correct, and that's right. This kind of explanation on its own leaves the person vulnerable to leaving, which reinforces the anxiety because they bailed, but it can be part of a combo solution. The evidence-based correct answer is D. Practice, if you said D, you can celebrate now, is practice intentionally hyperventilating over breathing in order to understand that anxiety sensations are not the same as cardiovascular events. You can elicit them on purpose and you won't die, right? That these things are going to go up. And so then you get in the test, your anxiety goes up a little bit. Oh gosh, my heart is racing. But then you say, hey, I practiced this every day for the last 2 weeks and before my last practice test, and the anxiety went down. So what you learn is that the MCAT is not a tiger, that the panic sensations themselves are not going to hurt me. And so then when you do get that sort of charge of panic or that charge of your heart rate or my armpit starts going, my brain will say, it's okay for me to sweat a bit. That doesn't mean that I'm failing or that I'm getting the questions wrong. Because these symptoms related to anxiety aren't dangerous. So this is what this looks like in behavioral science. You stay in the moment, called habituation. The anxiety goes down over time, and then your brain says, I'm going to go on to my next set of worries, and that's called extinction. So just to sum up these things up a bit, maybe hurtful-ish, probably hurtful, valid, helpful, evidence-based treatment, eliciting the anxiety on purpose. And this, you guys said, what about E? We like E. E is Freudian. So one of the things that we've learned about anxiety, that's Sigmund Freud. He'll be on your test, no doubt. One of the things that we've learned about anxiety is that it is reinforced, our thoughts drive it, and our behavioral avoidance teaches our old part of our brain, okay, I'm just trying to help you out. Let me keep doing this. So when we talk about anxiety, and when you go forward in your process, which you're the architect of, you're the architect of this amazing opportunity to be a provider. Remember to think about anxiety from a what would make it stop kind of way, as opposed to why am I like this? What's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you except that you're a human hardwired with the desire to succeed and to stay safe, and to manage the challenges of this life, right? So the question for yourself in the admissions process, a reasonable thing you're trying to do to perform well, is to ask yourself, what can I do to prove to my brain that I can do this, right? That this anxiety is not going to hurt me. What would make it stop? Okay, that's a lot. I think we're probably at close to time. I'm so sorry. Let's answer questions.
Thank you so much. It was an incredible presentation, and we have some fantastic questions. I just want to say these questions that came in were awesome. So the first one we're going to start with is this one. I'm just going to read it because the application process and even the MCAT is so fickle, so undecisive, and so unexpected. It feels like anxiety is inevitable because you have to be prepared to adjust to this kind of change. How do you manage being anxious while still being prepared for what is to come ahead?
Great question. There's gonna be a huge amount of uncertainty, and there's got to be a lot of productive anxiety on board, right? You've got to be able to anticipate what you don't know and the fact that you can't control a lot of parts of this. And so I really think it's important to put things in those buckets, recognize the productive anxiety, embrace it. Um, One of my favorite things to talk about is making a list. If I just look around my own desk, there's like these little check cards, right? That have a list on there. If you can make something into an action that you can knock out in the next day or week, then you know it's in the realm of productive anxiety, helping you manage the sort of insanity and the uncontrollable parts of this process. If it's something that is just a vague idea that you probably won't do anything about, then we're going to file it in the unproductive anxiety, and sort of file it away to worry about at that designated worry time once a week.
Great, thank you. I'm such a list maker.
That's good. I love it.
Okay, next question. How do you know when a behavior like postponing the exam is a necessary shift in your journey or a behavior that can make a negative impact on your anxiety?
I love that. That's a great question. And the way that I would say, don't put yourself in that position by having ad hoc, so in advance, goalpost. So you say, I'm going to decide whether to postpone or not based on the score on this practice test, and I want it to be over 510. And then I'm not going to postpone, or I want it to be under over 490, and I'm not going to postpone, or I want it to be, just set the goalpost ahead of time so that anxiety doesn't make the decision. You have some logical thing that's going to make the decision, because you can anticipate anxiety might snatch up that thing for me.
Great,
Okay.
thank you. Okay. How can I overcome perfectionism that leads to overstudying?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I would say again that the setting if then rules ahead of time is probably the best way, right? So I am going to study this area, this sort of subject area for a certain amount of time instead of till it feels right. Right. The other thing that I think is super, super important is to use the question bank resources instead of the sort of open-ended passive studying. Right. When you use the open-ended passive studying, the perfectionism will stay, do it until you feel like you've learned everything about this subject. When you use the question bank strategies, then you're practicing your execution as well as learning subject matter. And that prevents the perfectionism from becoming impairing, even if it's still on board, because you need to be practicing both.
Okay, we got several questions heading in this direction. When you get thoughts like, I won't ever be good enough to become a doctor, how can you decipher if that is a rational thought, i.e., with evidence, versus a thought driven by anxiety?
Go talk to some doctors. I mean, I say, respectfully, go talk to the people that you respect. Ask them, did you ever have this thought? Like, how do you know that you're good enough to take care of people? Right. And you'll find out that the best doctors have that thought as early in their career as you are, right? This sort of idea like, I'm perfect, I'm good enough to be a doctor, I can make all the decisions, I'm going to get everybody's life right. I don't think I've ever worked with colleagues on, in the psychology world or in the sort of MD world, that I've been like, yes, please take my child's life in your hand, who didn't sort of have this like, I got to make sure that I'm not quite sure that I'm quote unquote, I need to appreciate that this is a high responsibility, is what I'll say, that the most noble, wonderful doctors that I've worked with. So if you're having that thought, go and share it and say it out loud. It is a thought that deserves some airtime, and other providers would love to have that conversation with you, I promise.
Can you elaborate on the difference between time blocking and deadlines?
Oh, yes. Thank you for asking. I love a logistical thing. If you have a Google Calendar and you click on the very top row, or an Outlook calendar, if you click on above the day and um, you say these questions are due by this day, that's a deadline. But if you click on Friday and you say from 2 to 8, I'm going to work on these questions, that's time blocking. You're figuring out how much time something takes and you're taking that space up on your calendar. It doesn't mean you don't change it. You don't move that box around. Um, but you might put in that time block. I think it's going to take like 4 hours, and this is the day that it's due. And then you have to find space for it on your calendar. A deadline just tells you when something's due. It doesn't tell you how you're going to get it done or when. Time blocking says, this is when I'm going to do it.
Okay. Um, Sorry, hang on one moment. What recommendations do you have for comparing ourselves to other pre-meds or stressing over getting into top schools?
Um, I would say put it into the cognitive restructuring strategy, right? So and so got this on the test, or so and so's already got interviews here. That is a thought that can be challenged because underneath it is the catastrophe of, and so I'm never going to get into school, right? The unfortunate thing about sort of just the world of things is that there's a lot of spaces, and it's important to have an abundance mindset that there's a space for you somewhere. But there are, limitations to how many people a school can take. And so that's real. So you don't want to tell yourself, no, that's not real, but you want to challenge the thought that says that person, I need to be focused on that person as the benchmark, because that person is just the person proximal to you, right? And so taking that kind of idea, oh gosh, what if my scores aren't good enough, and making it into productive anxiety, which is, I'm going to go do some research here, I'm going to apply to this master's program, I'm going to go pay extra attention to my essays, right? That is how you take those kinds of unproductive thoughts, like so and so great, I'm never going to be great, and make it into a productive thought. How do I round myself out? Because 9 times out of 10, if you're focused on one person, you're overvaluing one factor related to admissions.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. As an ESL student, I feel a lot of anxiety about the cars section, and
Yeah.
I haven't been able to shake this fear of working through the passages. Is there anything I can do to manage or overcome this anxiety?
Um, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but I would say to when you come up with your strategy for how you want to approach things, and there's certain, there are different recommendations for that. Use a question bank kind of uh, system and set it to hard and do hard blocks of cars as much as you can, right? So that because your brain is going, okay, I'm an ESL student. There's some of these when they're really straightforward, I can do them. There's some of these when they're really hard, I can't. So challenge that roller coaster, set it to hard or set it to medium, and do question after question after question at a high level. And it'll force you to get off of that roller coaster. It'll force you to identify things that are challenging, but also force you to get off that roller coaster. So do more of it, more of it at a harder level as opposed to less. And remember, if you're an ESL student, there are other things about your application that are fabulous and that med schools are going to be interested in. And so you can emphasize those things and have those conversations and know that you are much needed and appreciated, even though this is a special area where it feels like it becomes a liability. There are a lot of areas where being an ESL student is extra highly valued, and remember that, right? And remember to emphasize that you don't have to be, you are a whole person, and that's great.
Dr. Hunter, thank you so much. This was so valuable, and we so appreciate your time. And to our students and educators, thank you again for joining us today. As a reminder, this session recording will be available in about 24 hours within the virtual fair platform. Please join us at 2 p.m. Eastern Time today for our next session. Watch What Happens Live, medical school mock interviews. And also remember that you can log in again tomorrow from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time to virtually connect with representatives from over 100 medical schools, post-bac programs, and student groups and associations. And we thank you again, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. I'm recording
Bye.
Amazing Hearts.